So we're going to look down the side of the boat. So the rear rod is just about where my hand is, off of these rods. And you can see how far it is to the tip of that rod. What's up, guys? It is July the 26th. It's hot outside, and my neighbor graciously allowed me to do this video under his nice shade trees, so I won't have to do this video in the sun and bake while I'm doing it. So I'm going to try to point out a few things. I get a lot of questions about spider rigging versus long lining versus tight lining, and I have those questions quite often, and I try to explain to people what methods to use and when and how, and to take away some of the guesswork. If you are like me and you're watching this video, I spend a lot of time looking at videos and trying to determine what method best fits me as a fisherman. So none of these methods, I don't want to say one of these methods are better than any other. My job today is to try to take out some of the guesswork that you may have when you're trying to set your boat up. Now, I have an 18-foot bass boat. The front of my bass boat is fairly narrow. You see a lot of guys that like to spider rig. There's 2 seats on the front, big wide front end. I don't have that luxury, and I don't spider rig that often. I do some at certain times of the year. So let's talk about the 3 methods and the terminologies that you may hear used and when they're used. And so the first terminology you hear is spider rigging. Multiple rods and rod holders presenting either minnows or jigs in a presentation. The second, tight lining. Still using multiple rods to display minnows or lures to the fish. Or you heard long lining, which you're dragging the lines out the back. Let's take a minute and let's break down the differences. So in spider rigging, you will see multiple rods around the front of the boat. And I'm going to turn this around and let's go look at the rods. So you may see something similar to multiple rods sticking out and fishing in different directions, as you do here. So the terminology spider rigging is the multiple use of rods around your boat. You don't necessarily need 10 rods to be successful. On the front of my boat, I use 4 rods. That's what I'm comfortable with using, and I found out with my narrow front end on my boat, 4 rods is all I can really handle on the front of the boat. Now we'll get into the lengths of the rods and how I set mine up when I'm trolling. So let's say you're spider rigging and you're set out and you're going to power troll straight down at about 0.8 to 1.3 miles per hour. That means you're going to set your trolling motor at that speed. 0.8 to 1.3 seems to be about the best speed to use when trolling. So you have all your rods down. When you're moving through the water column at that speed and you have all the rods out around the boat, you're going to need to weight your lure with anywhere from 1/4 to 3/4 of an ounce of weight, depending on how deep you're fishing. Now that keeps the line basically straight down, maybe back just a little bit, but that keeps the lure down in the zone you're trying to fish, whether it's 8, 10, 20 feet of water. And the boat is moving fairly quickly, 0.8 to 1.3 miles per hour through the water column. Now that's a method that's won a lot of tournaments and caught a lot of fish. Second method is tight lining, vertical, straight down, with either split shot and a minnow, 1/8 ounce jig, 1/16 ounce jig, 32nd ounce jig, and the boat is moving very, very slow. So you would use that method when you're fishing, say, isolated cover. Tight lining is more of an approach you would use if you was fishing brush piles, or if you was fishing a bridge piling, or you was fishing a hump or creek channel. Something specific that you wanted to keep your baits just above the structure that you're fishing. Let's say you're fishing a brush pile that you've sunk or you found somebody's. So let's say the brush pile is 20 feet of water. You want to keep your baits at just above that, say at 16, 18 foot, and you're going to take the trolling motor very slowly and move the boat back and forth over top of that structure, and of course the crappie around the structure are going to come up and feed. Now that's tight lining. Now I use that method late in the fall when I'm targeting crappie, that water temperature is dropping, they're sluggish. I have no more than 1/8 of an ounce weight or a jig or minnow, and my trolling motor is moving very, very slow. And the trolling motor is used very limitedly. It's not constantly turning to travel through the water column. That's kind of power trolling with the spider rig. So the terminology of spider rig kind of gets thrown around loosely. If you've got multiple rods out, people call it spider rigging, and that confuses a lot of people. So you've got power trolling with the spider rigs. You've got vertical tight lining with the jigs, where you're not really using the trolling motor, or you're using the trolling motor very limitedly. Now, third method we're going to talk about is long line trolling, and that means the lures are behind the boat, out behind you, and you're pulling them through the water column. Now, to regulate the depth at which the lure runs, it all depends on how far out, how much line you have out. Typically that's 40 to 50 feet of line out behind the boat, and depending on the weight of the lure is how deep the lure will run. So typically for me, in my opinion, if I'm running an 1/8 ounce jig with 50 feet of line, I'm usually trolling that lure somewhere between 10 and 12 foot deep in the water column. That's at 0.8 to 1.3 miles per hour. Typically, if I want to troll deeper, sometimes I'll take a 32nd or a 16th and add it, and I'll have 2 jigs that I'm running, always the lighter jig above the heavier jig, and that may get me down another 4 or 5 feet. Now, if I get into some shallower water that I'm trolling, and I want to troll higher in the water column, I shorten the length of line. So there's a couple of methods, and we'll get into that in a minute. So my preference is to long line troll out the back, preferably in the rear of the boat. For some reason, when the boat travels through the water column, the trolling motor's turning. Now this is long line trolling out the back, and that's what we're going to kind of target today. That's what we're going to do in the morning. We're got a double in the back. Oh yeah. Methods of trolling. I'm going to long line troll out the back of the boat. I catch more fish that way. That's not necessarily to say that is the best method for everyone. Everyone develops their own technique and what works for them. Hey, it's a great world out there, right? So as the boat moves through the water column, the trolling motor's creating current, the boat's pushing water, the bait fish move away from the front of the boat out to the side, and as the boat passes, all your bait fish and your fish will come back together in the back of the boat. And for some reason, usually when you're long line trolling, the back of the boat catches more fish than the front of the boat. For whatever reason. To recap, 3 methods. If you're spider rigging, you're power trolling with the spider rigs, you got to have a heavier weight, straight down, keep your lures at the depth that you want, or tight lining out the front where you're using very limited. You're very limited on how much trolling motor you're using to move the boat around. Because you're using very light lures, you move the boat, the lures come up like this and fall, you're not really catching fish. So you're fishing either bridge pilings or some type of structure that you're targeting, actual structure, and you want to keep your baits at a certain level. Hope that makes sense. Long line trolling, all the lures are out the back of the boat, and you're pulling the lures through the water column. Now, all methods have their advantages at times. Those are the three methods that we've covered and how to set up. Now, we're going to move to the front of my boat, and I'm going to show you, if you're limited for space, and this kind of caters to guys like myself who may not have the space on the front of the boat, or who, like myself, may not troll for crappie all the time. I fish for multi-species of fish, adapt my boat to do multiple species of fishing, and so I don't have the luxury of mounting a lot of rod holders around the boat and leaving them on all the time. Hey, if that's the way you want to fish and that's the way you're successful, more power to you. I'm not saying that you don't do that. But for the guy who just wants to mount a rod holder, do a little pulling some lines, or do some tight lining for crappie early spring and the fall, hey, this is a great method. So let's go look, and I'll show you what I've done on the front of the boat. Missed him. Oh, there he goes. Oh, he got it that time. So, hey, what's up, guys? So, as you can see, these are Loctite rod holders. All of these. I like the Loctites. I looked at multiple rod holders, and the Loctite seemed to suit my needs the best. I'm not saying that you have to go with the Loctite, but the Loctite has this base here on the bottom that I can mount and leave, and I can untighten these wing nuts, loosen it up, and I can take this off and get it out of my way when I'm fishing some other method. This is the way I set it up. I have a 7-foot rod here, which puts me out roughly 6 feet away from the boat. I have a 14-foot rod, which puts me 14 feet out to this side. So there is roughly 5 or 6 feet between those two lines. Now, sometimes guys set them every 2 feet, every 4 feet. I like to set my lines further apart when I'm trolling behind the boat, because if I turn a little bit, my lines don't get hung up. So you see, the third rod in the line is a 10-foot rod, which it has to go across the bow of the boat, approximately 3 feet. So that puts this line 7 feet off the stern in the rear as I'm trolling. And the number 4 rod is also a 14-foot, which I lose about 3 feet on the front rod, and that puts that line out about 10 feet off the stern in the rear. Now that's my 4 rods. Now, one note to self: when you set your rod holders up, set them to where you can reach and get them easily. Look, as a rule of thumb, when you're setting up your rod holder here, set them to where they're arm's length away, where you can easily pick these rods up. You don't want to have to get up out of your seat and reach and get a rod holder. See how close these are? These are right off my knee. This is my foot on the trolling motor. So I can sit here and I can watch left to right, and I can work these rods. I can easily reach and get this rod, and I can easily get this rod. Let's go to the rear of the boat and look how those are set up. Okay, so I'm back on the rear of the boat. I have an old Driftmaster rod holder here that someone gave me, and it holds 3 rods. Really great. No sense to me going to buy another Loctite when I didn't need to. On my right, I have another Loctite that I purchased, and so I use it on the back side when I'm striper fishing. I have rod holders when we're anchored, I can fish out the back of the boat. So the person in the back of the boat has more rods to fish. They have nothing to do. They don't have to worry about guiding the front of the boat. They can come back and they can work these rods to catch the fish. Also, if you're in the front, note to self, if you're in the front and you're long line trolling, the person in the back needs to dip your fish, because as a crappie moves up, he has a tender mouth. You need to dip him at the back of the boat. Many times you may lose him before you get to the front. Oh, he come off. And working those long rods on the front of the boat, it's kind of difficult to lift the fish over in the boat. So the person in the back of the boat can really help you with dipping a fish and getting him actually into the boat. So let's hop out of the boat and look at how these lines would line up. So we're going to look down the side of the boat. So the rear rod is just about where my hand is, off of these rods. And you can see how far it is to the tip of that rod. See the tip of the rod right here? So approximately the rear line is about 4 feet off. And then you got another 4 feet of line off the tip of this rod. The same occurs for the opposite side. That's how you want to probably lay them off. If you turn the bow of the boat, or you have to make a soft turn, you don't run the risk of hanging those rods up in the rear. We're going to look back up this side. You can see where this rod ends, and you can see where your 7-foot rod, that line is approximately here. So therefore you don't have a lot of lines getting hung up. That makes sense? I hope so. Anyway, you'll see in the morning how this all lays out and how it works. So let's talk about rod length. So as a rule of thumb, when you're using your trolling motor, and crappie are fairly shallow, and I'm saying shallow from 2 feet to 8 feet deep, and you're using your trolling motor and you are power trolling, or you're moving through the water column and your trolling motor is constantly running, then you need at least a 14-foot rod, at least a 14-foot rod, to get the lure away from the boat, because the fish are going to move away from your boat. If you are tight lining, straight down, deeper water, limited trolling motor use, you can get away with a much shorter rod and your rod holders. He said if you've never used a 16-foot rod, he said there's a big learning curve, and he was right. He said I would suggest to start with a 12-foot rod till you get used to using the longer rods. So I chose to go with a 14. 14 was really the minimum for when you was going to run the rods out the front of the boat, out in front. Now it winds up that a 14-foot rod runs really good because I like to long line out the side. And as a rule of thumb, when I'm tight lining in the fall for crappie straight down, usually my outside 14-foot rods outfish my 10 and my 7 on the inside for whatever reason. Don't know if the trolling motor spooks them or whatever reason, but as a rule of thumb they do. Again, we're going to recap the 3 methods or ways to spider rig, long line troll. So you can power spider rig to where you're moving through the water column 0.8, 0.3 miles per hour, using a weighted lure or a minnow, using a 1/4 to 3/4 of an ounce egg sinker to keep the lure down at the level you want, and you're moving through the water column. You can tight line, limited trolling motor use with your line straight down. You can long line out the rear of the boat. That is the method I prefer to do. That is the method you'll see used in the morning when we go to the lake. We're going to be long lining out the rear of the boat, so you can get some ideas about how that works. Hey guys, I hope this helps, And hey, I'll see you in the morning, and we'll see if we can put some fish in the boat.